Last summer, after months of intense protests led by student activists, Awami League government of Bangladesh was finally forced to step down after in power for 3 decades. The rule of the Awami League and its leader Sheikh Hasina has been characterized as a regime of extreme state repression, corruption, and authoritarianism. The demands of demonstrators who were initially protesting against what they saw as an unfair public sector job quota, which gave unfair advantage to Awami League supporters, was met with blackouts, mass arrests, and eventually killings committed by the government. When Sheikh Hasina was finally forced to resign on the 5th of August last year, the country she left behind was one which was rejoicing, but was nonetheless deeply divided and politically and economically unstable. In her place took over Dr. Muhammad Yunus, a world-renowned economist and Nobel laureate, known for pioneering the concept of microfinance. The overthrowing of authoritarian regimes through mass movements such as this is not an unfamiliar sight in much of the world. But what is unfortunately just as common is the failure of reforms to be long-lasting, is the failure of changes to be long-lasting, changes that can prevent a country from returning back to a previous system of corruption, authoritarianism, and despotism. Today's talk is how Bangladesh can head towards a future which avoids this grim possibility, and instead how it can embark on a roadmap towards lasting reforms. Professor Stefan Dercon is a world-renowned economist and an academic of public policy who specializes in such fields. He currently teaches at the Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford, and also serves as the director for the Center for the Study of African Economies. As well as this, he also serves as an economic advisor for numerous governments, including the UK's own Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. Professor Dercon has also written many books on development, including Gambling on Development, which was published in 2022. One of the main themes of this book was how reforms need the support of established elites in order to be long-lasting. And this, of course, is a major topic of concern in the question of lasting reforms in Bangladesh. And so, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the mic to Professor Dercon. Thank you all very much.
Very good. So, well, I'm really glad to be able to speak here today. So, I'm an academic, but probably more these days I try to work in various countries and try to understand how one can, maybe as an outsider, support a little bit in bits of change and bits of progress. So I work in quite a few countries at the moment. I hope it's okay to mention that I do work quite a bit in Pakistan these days, a country that is well behind anything and in so many things in terms of what's happening in Bangladesh. But I was lucky again to be able to travel again to Bangladesh in December and talk to some of the advisors of the chief advisor, Yunus, and talk to other observers and some of the academics to kind of refresh my engagement with it. And in fact, with a small group of people here in Oxford, we are preparing a couple of op-eds for Bangladeshi newspapers, commenting on what's going on and hopefully be constructive as an outsider in this respect. Let me do in this brief talk, do two things. Basically, sketch a little bit of a framework, how I can think and how I actually almost conceptually think about why Bangladesh changed to the extent it did and it didn't over the last few decades, and then actually try to apply this a bit to Bangladesh, both what happened, why then actually, how in that context you could explain what's been happening recent years, and then looking forward. and then looking forward. And the looking forward I'll do specifically by commenting a little bit on some of the key documents that emerge at the moment. As you know, there's lots of committees going on, but there was a white paper on the economy, and there was recently a note written on the kind of the task force report on what we could be doing in Bangladesh, all 550 pages of all the things that could be done. And just talking a little bit about it, where this may lead us, okay? And I should say that it's a real pleasure always to engage with Bangladesh, because even under Sheikh Hasina, it was always an interesting country. There was a lot going on. And it's with all the bad things that were going on in recent years, actually there's quite a lot of good stuff going on as well, and change that happened that actually makes me, when I go to places, for example, in Africa, all the time saying, you should learn from Bangladesh. It's always worth looking at Bangladesh. Don't look at Korea or Japan. They're not going to tell you anything. Bangladesh is a much more interesting case for most countries in the world to learn from. And that includes these days that I tell Pakistan that as well. I'm not sure how receptive that is. But try to get there, because it is interesting. And in fact, of course, today is somehow, I know that I described it. I was in another country that I won't name now, somewhere in Southeast Asia recently, and I described, the Bangladeshi government today as probably the most or the best or the most well-meaning government in the world at the moment. Where do you get civil society to run the government? And it's very well-meaning. Now, we'll come back to that. Well-meaning is not enough, and that's where we'll get to. Okay, let me briefly sketch. Okay, so I'm going, as ever, if I talk these days, I will plug my book. And plugging my book means briefly describing the framework. Okay, so when I talk about, why countries are succeeding in development and why they're not, there is a necessary condition. It's never sufficient, but there's a necessary condition, without which no progress will be made. And that necessary condition is that somehow the political, military, economic, business, civil service elite wants development to happen. Now, it sounds very self-evident, but there's plenty of countries in the world I can name where they don't want development to happen, where they have other interests in mind. And so the way I describe that, political scientists will often talk the elite bargain, the deal between leading groups. So elite groups, they have blocking power. It's not that they will make it happen necessarily, but they can block things. If I go to Pakistan, I will say elites have systematically blocked progress there, because the vested interests are so strong that progress shouldn't be happening. If I go back to India in the 1980s, vested interests were really avoiding any of the necessary reforms to actually get growth and development to really take off. If I go to Nigeria, an oil-rich economy, you don't have to know much about it beyond that it's totally screwed up, okay? So fundamentally, there's so much natural resources. Well, actually, there isn't that much natural resources, but there's just enough natural resources that if I belong to about 100,000 people that have connections to those people in power, I'll have a great life and a house in London, and all the rest have very little, okay? And the 320 million other people have very little. Okay, so think of it, if that's the elite deal, I'm just going to distribute the oil revenue amongst a small group of people and that's all I do, well, that's not growth and development, okay? The GDP may be high, but that's not growth and development. So you want that commitment, but it can't just be words. You can't simply have a president or prime minister standing up and say, I want growth and development, trust me. No, you have to be able to show it. And usually, I would say there's probably about 3 things that you want to see. And the 3 things are that actually a general effort to work around political stability and economic stability. Okay, macroeconomic stability, but also political stability. So kind of knowing that there will be people that may not be necessarily in power, but are influential enough that actually you better take them on board. So you have to have a broad coalition. And in a way, that's sometimes a good way of thinking about sometimes in Western countries, that they come, of course, from a time when growth and development didn't really was important, but somewhere in the 20th century, it became probably more and more established. And it means, for example, that every party in a democracy like the UK, campaigns about getting better working health services and better working government and better working economy and more job creation. They all want it. They may well think a bit differently about it, but they actually have broadly shared objectives, and they may disagree on that, but that means somehow you're not going to do stupid things because you actually want more or less the same things. You're not going to do things that are simply about lining a few people's pockets and making the whole system collapse because you couldn't care less. No, you're not going to do it. So you need to actually work on a form of that stability. You need to work on also macroeconomic stability and not derailing everything. And we'll come back to that a bit on Bangladesh in a moment. A second thing is that you know what you have to work with. Okay? Now, everybody that works a bit on development tends to like the idea of the developmental state. And everybody says that's what you should look at because that's what happened in Southeast Asia. That's what happened in Japan, Korea, and China. The state taking the lead in all the development, and yeah, you need to have a developmental state. Now, it's an interesting thing. It is true they had a developmental state, but they also had a few other conditions. And one of these conditions was that they had a centralized government for probably about 1,000 years. Borders that were extremely well defined. They tend to have actually a meritocratic bureaucracy. China has had in its Confucian times at least 1,000 years of centralized exams to become a civil servant. Now that means that when George is in power, they can't simply put the friends of George into the civil service position, but actually everybody has to go through the same state exam. So you have a meritocratic bureaucracy. Now, a lot of East Asian and some Southeast Asian countries have that. Long history of well-established kingdoms, borders that were well-defined, a civil service that has a long history to develop, and so on. Now, if I have that, and I'm the Communist Party of China, and I come to power in the 1940s, and I want to think, how shall I do development? Well, let me use the state. And if I was given a choice in China, I would have used the state because I have a very powerful, well-organized, structured instrument to do this. But similarly, if I'm General Park in Korea in the 1960s and I get to power there and I want to actually do development as well, I'm also going to use industrial policy and quite a lot of state intervention because I have an accountable state that will actually really deliver. Now, if I am Nigeria and my state is entirely built up of giving jobs to my friends and then giving them some oil revenue, and I suddenly say, I'm going to develop through the state-led development, you know what will happen. Or indeed, if I'm Bangladesh, and I say after the early 1970s, and I come to power, am I going to have a really meritocratic system of bureaucracy? Or, no, I'll give my friends that help me get power and get the independence going, give them jobs. You have a very different state. Okay, so the second thing is really know what you have to work with. Be self-aware of the state. Except for in East Asia, no country has a state that is strong enough to lead development. So if you go to Indonesia, quite successful in development, they had to do it through the market because they didn't have a strong enough state. They came as decolonized after colonial times. They gave the people who won the independence struggles all the jobs. And you have a very corrupt state. And corrupt in terms of lining the pockets and using state-owned enterprises to line their pockets. Now, you're not going to then do development. So when General Suharto in the early 1970s needed to find a way of, in his case, getting legitimacy to do some development, he had to invite the private sector, including from Japan, the former rulers, during the Second World War, to actually start investing. He had to do a private sector model of actually getting development going. You couldn't do it just from the state. Okay, so be self-aware what you have. And if you want to be successful, do it. And then the third one that you have, as I said, you need to have a way of stability. You need to be self-aware of the instruments you have, the state you have. And then thirdly, you need to be willing to correct, learn. I've studied economics for, I was going to say most of my life, but definitely most of my adult life. I've tried to understand, reading all the people in terms of saying, okay, how do I now get growth? I always take for granted the sentence that probably the greatest growth economist, he passed away about 2 years ago, Robert Solow, actually said, I know I don't know the recipe, I know the ingredients of growth. Interestingly, he said that when he was asked, how can we get growth in Bangladesh? So he literally said, I'm sorry, I can't tell you how to get growth in Bangladesh. I know the ingredients, but don't ask me for a recipe. I don't know what the recipe for Bangladesh is. So it means that every country needs to find a recipe that kind of works for growth and development. That means learning. Now, what you need for learning, you have two choices. Either you learn very fast internally. For example, if you have a very strong state like the Chinese Communist Party and you impose strict targets that you need to do, and if you don't get it, you'll end up being jailed. That's basically how China did it in the 1980s, state-led development with very strong targets. They want to achieve it, and then learning if they didn't achieve it, learning quickly from the errors and then correcting them, experimenting as they often talked about. Or, if you can't do it through within the state, internal accountability is really hard because you're in Nigeria, nobody will ever bother you because being in the state is just about lining your pockets. So you need external processes of accountability. So you need maybe things like elections or a free press that holds you to account, because that's essentially how we do it in democracies. I come from Belgium. We don't have a very good history of a very well-disciplined state that is non-politicized. In fact, our state is entirely. You need to have a party membership card to be a member of the civil service in Belgium. In fact, it's divided based on the composition in parliament. Now, that's not the best recipe for a meritocratic bureaucracy if they're all politically appointed in your senior bureaucratic positions. But then basically, you do it through election processes and democracy process. So democracy is a form of an accountability, and you better do it if you don't have the kind of state that can have very strong internal accountability. So I'm of course alluding already to it. There are autocratic states that can be quite successful, like China was, because it has a meritocratic state, like Singapore is. It's actually quite autocratic, doesn't really like dissent. It can be very successful, but because it has a very meritocratic state, it can set up the systems of correction. But if I go to Congo DRC and I have or I go to some of the periods of military regimes in Pakistan, autocratic states, well, I have a state that is not set up to be very meritocratic and very well disciplined. As a result, I don't have a control mechanism to actually keep everything in check. And then, without that democracy, we can't quite do it. So actually one of the results is that we find in the world, there are very successful autocracies and very successful and very, very failing autocracies. Actually, interestingly, we also have very successful democracies, but actually, unfortunately, democracy is not a sufficient condition to actually getting these systems to work well. I go to Malawi, a functioning democracy, but it's a stagnant country. So basically, again, it's not as simple as democracy delivers progress or not. Worthwhile thinking about, and we'll come back to that in Bangladesh. So, let's turn to it now. If I have that framework about overall commitment, some stability, self-aware state, and accountability, Bangladesh is an interesting case, and of course, anyone who talks about Bangladesh when they are outsiders, they love to quote Kissinger. We know he never said it, but that's another matter, that Bangladesh is a basket case. It was probably one of his advisors mentioned it somewhere, but it was a very good headline that Kissinger supposedly claimed that Bangladesh was a basket case in the mid-1970s somewhere. And it looked very bad. I know actually personally, my very first essay when I studied economics was development economics, and the question was, is Bangladesh a basket case? And that was in 1982, and I said, yes, absolutely a basket case. Because climate pressures, population growth, terrible economic governance, terrible governance and corruption in the state, no way we're going to get anywhere, okay? I did say that. It's interesting that countries surprise us, because I definitely still always remember saying this, and in fact I got good marks on it. My professor also thought I was right, and he was a Bangladesh expert. But there is that element more of, what happened in Bangladesh? Now it's very interesting. The 1970s were absolutely rotten. You know, after the independence war, the famine, the last natural disaster-based famine probably we have in history of the world. We have then plenty of political murders sowing the seeds for endless political struggle ever since, and all the way to military takeover and God knows what, an economic experiment that was already failing of state-led development, you know, and everything was more or less failing. So we come somewhere in the 1980s and maybe reach the 1990s. And then suddenly people start observing, actually they observed it much later where we see it in the data, things started to function actually reasonably well in the economy. So we begin to get the rise of the garment sector. Yeah, there's remittances flowing in because Bangladesh always had a lot of migrants and still quite dependent on it, so it helped with the balance of payments. But we also started seeing civil society organizations like BRAC and Grameen, and I will say especially BRAC, delivering massively and impressively on all kinds of things. And so you get books like, if you've never read it, Naomi Hossain's book on the Aid Lab. I think a new version has come out in Bangladesh just now. Documenting that is that actually, look, it's not a miracle. It's not necessarily a surprise for the people doing it. But where it is a surprise, and that was really interesting when I gave a talk 3 years ago, I think, no, 2 years ago in Dhaka, with all kinds of people who had been involved in that period in government and civil society. Everybody agreed something seemed to have changed, and somehow that kind of elite commitment grew between different parts of the civil service, of the political class, and of the civil society, and that you actually started working more or less together. A bit like it was uncoordinated coordination. Everybody started doing more reasonable things. And everybody claimed that the thing they did made a really big difference. So there were former ministers saying, no, it is when we liberalized the fertilizer market, that was the change. Was people from the National Bank saying, no, we started being more sensible in the National Bank economic policies. And then the civil society said, no, it was all us, nothing to do with you. And then get the politicians, no, it was us, by the way. And actually, the democracy was working reasonably well initially, and the transitions of power were happening. So these are more or less in the way I want to think about it. Actually, elites I would say, were realistic enough to realize, oh my God, this whole independence struggle that's created so much suffering for so much people, are we just throwing it away? Do we have any legitimacy if the country ends up in this kind of basket case situation, where actually so many people lost their lives first in the independence struggle and then subsequently with the massive famine, and then with all the disruption and then we don't have an economy to speak of and the countryside is really impoverished and so on and so on and so on. So kind of maybe saying, and let's forget, most of the people also, including in civil society, came in the end out of what I would call the elite people that were influential, well-connected families and so on. They were also clearly quite aware, yes, all these things. And I think Bangladesh is this kind of interesting case where this elite commitment didn't come because there was a clear leader of it, but it came in a bit more decentralized way. But maybe credit again to Bangladeshi society, reasonable things were done by quite a few people that have powerful positions. You got, meanwhile, the garment sector developing. That was very important. But if you think of it, and if you were to study it, the central bank started doing sensible things so that the garment sector could develop. And let me explain that. And in fact, the political class similarly. A lot of people in the garment sector initially were not deeply politically connected. So much later that they were all in parliament. But before that, they were not. But they were not killed off. The state was helping them a little bit, but not that much. Probably just enough, very little. Anyone wants to claim there was a massive amount of Korean-style industrial policy in Bangladesh? No, not at all. It was much more, you can get on with it, but you did sensible things. For example, you didn't overvalue the exchange rate, so it meant you stayed competitive. You had a competitive exchange rate basically much earlier than, say, when India and Pakistan ever did it. So you actually could sell internationally because you made somehow the exchange rate such that you got quite a lot of local currency for a dollar. You could earn quite a lot. And then you have a labor-intensive industry that starts happening and you absorb people in it. And I'm not saying that they were incredibly good jobs, but they were definitely much better for lots of women than making dung cakes in this countryside for fuel, which is always what I want to remind you, is that that's what women do in the countryside, having their hands in the dung and making dung cakes in many countries of the world. Then garments may not be a very good job, but it's definitely a little bit better than some of the others. So you could get somehow positive things happening. So anyway, starts happening. There is the growth thing. There is a bit sensible macroeconomic policy. There is good enough governance. Democracy is kind of working. If once in a while you need to have a caretaker government or whatever you call them coming in, but it was there was transitions of power, there was correction moments, there was actually initially reasonably well functioning. Yeah, there was corruption. The state was what it is. It was corrupt, and it had quite bad Transparency International corruption indicators throughout, with very little change. But you had that. But a few things were very striking to bring it back to that framework. There was, within bounds, there were endless strikes and bits of violence between the parties on the street, but there was reasonable overall stability. There was reasonable, good macroeconomic stability as well, economic stability. Then it's interesting, and that's actually why I'm actually telling to everybody, look at Bangladesh. This is a self-aware state. Now, what do I mean by that? This is a corrupt state, okay? From the beginning, from independence, a fairly corrupt. A job in the state is a license to get a bit of money, not necessarily a house in Saint-Tropez, but to get access to some bits. And it's understood. And not everybody, not every civil servant, but there's some. And it's there. But one of the things that I find very striking, that I always tell to other audiences also, and you should really be aware of it. I worked for the aid agency in the UK for DFID, and BRAC was a big recipient of foreign aid. In fact, between Australia and the UK, we probably gave something like $1 billion in the 2010s to BRAC. $1 billion. Now, the amazing thing is not that we gave them that money. A lot of aid is given. The amazing thing is that the Bangladeshi government allowed us to give BRAC that money. People may know about India. NGO laws restrict foreign funding. In the US, foreign funding is not allowed for NGOs. In most African countries, the government would really be worried about civil society getting all this money. So you got in Bangladesh, despite everything else, and in fact everything we know next, that was okay. You could do it. You got a situation at some point that 2/3 of the community health workers, with full awareness of the state, came from BRAC. And 1/3 only from the state. But they were not doing what you got in most countries. The state with its health workers and the NGO would also have its health worker in the same place. They divided the work. Now that's a self-aware state that doesn't have the pride in saying, no, we do health, not you. We need to get all the money. No, you can't get all this money. And it's quite ironical, of course, if you think it's the same government that arguably now is being deeply criticized by a government run by civil society that allowed civil society to grow as powerful as it was. So this is interesting. I mean, I'm not saying that I made a mistake, but it's interesting. I actually would say that's something that goes through. And in fact, if you read this book by Naomi Hossein, Aid Lab, it's one of the striking things. That actually, this was a place where if there was a government from outside was keen to try to spend aid reasonably, they had an opportunity. And the government was actually quite supportive that you did it. That's why the book is called the Aid Lab. There's all kinds of things, including the oral rehydration salt and sugar mixture, that was trialed at scale in Bangladesh because the government allowed it to happen. In lots of other countries, it would be much harder. So it's a self-aware state, despite all the things you know about it. That's good. And then the final thing is this sense of accountability. Now, and the learning. Now, that's where the interesting bits is. So initially, democracy was working quite well. Changes of power happened, not always smooth, but whatever, but they were happening, okay? And BNP and Awami League came in power and changed them as well at some point. Now, that's a form of the external accountability. Of course, the state is weak. Internal accountability was non-existent. And so, of course, that's then the That's then the problem. And now you see already where I would allude to, is like what comes in more recent times. You needed that external accountability mechanism, an openness of debating, criticizing a government, because that's the only correction mechanism you had, because within the state is not meritocratically built up. It can't function really to actually correct its own errors. And it gets a bit of out of hand. And that's, of course, where we get to. Initially, that was working. In most societies, that's a problem. Okay? Even in democracies, it's a problem at some point or another. Do you allow them? Do you give people access to the data to actually criticize you and whatever? You try all you can not to do this. But then we can, of course, see what the period happened in since 2010, when the Awami League the period came back. Now, and that's now quite an interesting thing. It's not that the state in its functionality changed that much. Even though everybody writes now is that this last 15 years was incredible corruption, the Transparency International indicators of perception of corruptions are identical to 15 years ago. They are identical. That underlying state is not really changed that much. The internal accountability was always rubbish. Of course, what changed is the external accountability. That somehow the political space shrunk, and actually it led to Bangladesh not being able to renew itself and to rethink what it is doing. And that's probably where we get to. You know, that's probably where we're actually talking about the derailment. Now, it doesn't predict that students would do what students did. But somehow or another, it became more problematic. And in the end, where we got to is that, you know, yes, this is still a country with massive amount of progress in economic progress, massive progress in development outcomes, but we definitely reached in the last 5 years or so a moment where can this be sustained? Now, it's a very common thing. In most countries, this progress of growth and development goes in cycles of 10, 15, 20 years. You know, in China, we had 10 years after Deng Xiaoping, we had Tiananmen Square, which is basically people asking for accountability also within the system. They managed to repress it, you know, and a playbook that fortunately didn't work in Bangladesh, but it was the same playbook. We can repress this and now we'll keep on going. China then had to actually correct its own economic model, and in the 1990s it had to do massive reforms of the state-owned enterprises because it was stuck. So if you think of it, it's not as if China just did everything linearly since 1979. It also had these moments of crisis and pressure. Now we come to Bangladesh more recently. So it's not surprising that the pressure point came. It's surprising how it came. And maybe the fact that civil society has always been so powerful and maybe condoned, you know, you could argue that if Hasina people ever write their memoirs and say we should have gone after Yunus much harder and we should never have allowed BRAC and all the other organizations to continue. Fortunately, they didn't. Okay, so they created. It's actually quite a common thing. This is actually almost consistent with modernization theory, is that development creates more people that actually will expect to be partake in any of the progress. So if you have growth and development, you actually get typically more people that actually want to stake in the progress. And you get these things. In my book, I wrote about Ethiopia, and Ethiopia imploded actually while I was writing it in a similar sense. They had a real good program, but again, young people came on the streets and they wanted to stake in it. Meanwhile, a group of people said, no, we want the status quo. The elite that had power said, we want to keep the status quo. And again, as I started, elites have the power to try to stop. That's the only power they have. They failed this time. They may have failed this time in Bangladesh. Let's come back to that. But that's basically it. Pressures come. Development is a great thing. Democracy doesn't cause progress, but actually growth and development tends to create the conditions where there's more pressure to expect more external accountability, i.e. democratic processes and so on. You expect Tiananmen Squares to emerge. You expect these kind of things to happen. Now, but where are we now? We had the turnaround, we can look at it. So let me talk briefly about, am I doing too kind of, okay, I will briefly talk 5-10 minutes and then we'll stop. We looked at a white paper, and those who haven't looked at it, the white paper was basically, it came about as a kind of a review of, does actually the baseline look in the way we do, and everybody said the data are all made up in the last 2 years and whatever. So that team wrote a report, created a baseline, tried to do it, and we had conversations with, for example, planning advisor, Wahiduddin and Mahmoud, and he said that was really the question. When people offered it, it would be very helpful to know, do we actually know where we are? Of course, and they wrote this report and saying GDP is overstated, all kinds of things are overstated, and we should be very careful. Now, one wants to be very careful with it. We want to be very careful with that kind of work. And there's actually 2 reasons for it. The first one is, you should never go and be part of writing victor's history. As I said, the report is full of commentary about how corrupt the whole country became. And it's true, the elite bargain got more and more captured. But Transparency International indicators suggest it was always corrupt and it was similarly corrupt as 15 years earlier. So it's not that it had changed. And I was making the argument earlier, it was more that because the political space closed more down, there was no more further check on it, but it was always corrupt and it was always similarly corrupt. So crony capitalism, yes, was there, but crony capitalism, arguably, there are always the incentives for it to emerge. Okay. So to simply saying it's all suddenly got so much worse, want to be careful. You don't want to write the victor's history simply. And that's a related thing. What you don't want to do in this period of a few years, and it will be a few years because there's huge pressure that the elections should happen, not least by BNP. They won't say it too loudly, but they would love the election not happen too quickly. The IMF program should be more or less progressing, that they can't be blamed for it. The point is a bit, you give an open door to arguably a very similar elite to take power, and you've actually made the baseline now look so much worse, so it's going to be very easy to claim success and blame everything that it was, we started so badly, don't believe the data. Everything was far worse than the data ever told us. So you're now going to give actually a free hand for the new political government to go in and say, you give them the perfect excuse to not do anything. You give them the perfect excuse to not do anything. Now, surely that's not how you should think if you want to do this. And so I really worry about this report that actually, trying to say, there was never a progress and never a miracle. No, it doesn't help any of us. If we want progress in this country, make it hard for the next government. Don't make it easy. Don't say it. Let's actually agree there was quite a lot of progress. To be honest, even when we looked at the data again, yes, if per capita GDP is a bit lower, these macro indicators, they still make Bangladesh, even in the worst case scenario that the report describes, they're a pretty strong performer. And they're still, not a miracle, but a really, really strong performer. And just not underestimate it. Despite all the rotten politics, Bangladesh has made a huge amount of progress. Also, the Human Development Indicator, maybe it's there, and former student of mine has been begging to have a conversation with me because he wants to prove that the indicators, the Human Development Indicators, are actually worse than the white paper says. In terms of the progress from where you were is still putting shame to quite a lot of states in India, and definitely shame to Pakistan. I should not underestimate that the progress that was made is quite remarkable. It's not helping anyone to try to create a global impression that Bangladesh is far worse than you think it is. Because one of the things you need is people to want to invest there, want to actually think this is a worthwhile place to actually buy things from and say, no, this is a dreadful place. Now everybody's far more exploited than this. I shouldn't buy that shirt from them anymore. No, that's the last thing you want. That they don't buy your stuff anymore. You want Samsung to come and invest there. You need to get the investment in. You need jobs to be created. and talking Bangladesh down, which the white paper to some extent does, is really not helpful. So it's an important thing in the public discourse. Now we come to the task force. And they said, okay, they told us also they agree with some of the analysis. We should be careful with the baseline, but we need to do better. And the op-ed, one of my, we thought up a title, and this is basically, the task force report is a bit like what the government should do in the next few years, and probably try to do as much as it can, because then the BNP comes in power again, and maybe we don't know what they will do. Okay, so we want to be a bit careful. So the title of the op-ed we wrote is Building Sweden in 700 Days. You know, you should read this thing, 550 pages, 16 pages of recommendations what you should reform in infrastructure. You have endless pages of recommendations that the government should do quickly. Think of the state you have, and I've been emphasizing, you have a very weak state. The fact that you now have another political government or a caretaker government now and then a new political government will not suddenly change the entire civil service into Singapore. You don't have the state to deliver much. So don't try to suggest you're going to build Sweden in 700 days. And I mean that as an analogy, as the typical idea of actually quite a nice state that is very liberal, that has really good social provisions where the state provides and thinks through, there's very low corruption. No, this is not going to be. Be aware of what you have. Don't try to do more than that. And then, so basically, it means that you have maybe 700 days. You probably have fewer before the BNP will be in power. Let me put it like this. Maybe 18 months before elections will have to be held. Try to think of what are the 3-4 things we can really do. Try to think carefully about that. Don't try to campaign for everything. You know, don't try to campaign for both a total overhaul of the justice system, make sure that all the transitional justice is being done for all the violence that happened, and you want to do that all reforming and implementing justice in 700 days? Well, you can do this, and you'll do it very badly, and people will write about it, how unjust it will have been, because you can't do this in 700 days. So you need to think carefully. Economic reform, procurement reform, fiscal reforms, getting people to pay the right taxes. Think of a few things. Building up maybe a second chamber and accountability in the politics, trying to get a maybe term limit, you know, have a few things. Term limit, maybe a second chamber. Wow, it would be amazing. And something about political appointments of the judicial system. 3 things. Maybe that's as much as you can actually achieve in this period. So simplify. Simplify, make it easier. Don't make complicated reforms because you have it. And then, related to that, is so simplify the things. So work with what you have and then simplify things, have a few things. Realize you have a state that doesn't know how to deliver very well, and then make it all simplification as well. And then just realize a point of legitimacy. It was so amusing, I must say, as an outsider, to sit in rooms with young people, people from the Youth Policy Forum when sitting in Dhaka, and they all have incredible ambitions, and especially hearing also that student leaders really would want the caretaker government to stay in power for much longer. Now, this is an interesting thing. You want more democracy, but please, let's not have elections. Let's please avoid having much happening. You know, there's a legitimacy issue. You know, you can't do that. However much I would love these civil society leaders to be there for a while. But the legitimacy point, you can't do that. You have to, again, recognize what you have. You do not have the time. So basically recognize that even if Yunus and Co now say that there will be an 18 months election, it'd probably be the pressure to be 17 months soon, and then 16 months, and then 15 months. The pressure is building. Understand that, because it is part of legitimacy. You know, you can't just forever be there, the technocratic government that suddenly does all the changes. No. Be willing to. If you want more democracy, find a few things, and then be willing to live with it. But, and I will end with this now, most likely, I don't know, other people have other views, most likely we'll have a political government, BNP government. There's other configurations possible. Maybe there's a student party, but my own sense would be they're not going to break through. You need a second chamber for maybe young votes, young people to be able part of the accountability system. That will all be good. But the BNP government will come in. If Army League's allowed to stand, they'll try to squash them. If they are not allowed to stand, they will also squash them. So, there's a politics there of their legitimacy, and it's partly their problem, their game that they need to play in their heads, whether they want them or not. But there will be a government, and we should not forget that BNP didn't clean up corruption in the past, that actually they're not perfect either, they will be very political. There will be cronies rewarded for supporting them and helping them to be in power. There will be new business elite that will have the WhatsApp number of the new prime minister. There will be, these things will happen. Now, since you know this will happen, think of those things that provide most chance to at least have a little bit of a better governance, a bit better democracy in the country than you had before. So a few checks and balances that you can build in. And then, to then conclude as well, with that, don't forget my earlier point. No point talking Bangladesh down for that new government. Make it hard. Just say, actually, pretty good place. We've made a lot of progress. Show that you can do better now. And generally do it. And don't give the chance, and don't do their work for them by lowering the baseline so that you make it really easy to actually go and then in the field and do a survey and say, oh, wow, we've now made so much growth, so much more people educated, or so much more people healthy. Don't make it easy for them. Make it hard. That's what you should do in the system. I'll stop now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for this very insightful talk. I think we're going to take 2 questions. And then
Okay.
we'll wrap up. So, does anyone have any questions?
I find it interesting some of the comparisons you made between Bangladesh and the current situation in Syria. I mean, there's definitely not a one-to-one comparison, but a lot of what you said seems to apply in terms of an interim government with kind of maybe questionable legitimacy, trying to build interim reforms in a system that are based on a weak state previously. So, like, would you give a lot of the same advice to the current Syrian government?
No, let me quickly answer that one. It's that no, I would give different advice. Let's simply say the history of Mr. Yunus and several of the advisors speaks for themselves. We should not be far less suspicious of them. I wouldn't give them the same advice. There is legitimacy to some extent in terms of the people. They're not trying to invent new laws to justify what they're doing. And arguably, of course, there's a history of this kind of government in Bangladesh as well. I don't know how constitutional it is, but there is a provision for it. So no, I wouldn't give them the same advice, because actually Syria is an absolute mess. And actually Syria is in an absolutely dreadful position. And we're talking there about the most minimal amount of building up the most basic institutions of economic governance. Despite the fact that you generally could be very concerned with the previous governor of the central bank, of the Bank of, what's called Bank of Bangladesh or something, the BB, Bangladesh Bank, isn't it? Yeah, the central bank. You could be concerned with some of the leadership. You actually have a serious thing. So, for example, we have a conversation with some people that try to say, okay, let's actually try to get a basic central bank already, so that at least there is a little bit of the control of who has the printing presses for the currency. That was quite a useful, minimal thing for the state. We're not there in Bangladesh, okay? So you wouldn't do that. And the legitimacy, we would limit to it. For me, the legitimacy is not that today the current government in Bangladesh doesn't have it. The problem emerges that it wants to outstay its welcome. It's a bit like doing a third term if you're in a 2-term system. It should be a transitional, temporary thing, and you should be willing to accept and it focuses your mind that you will have to prioritize. You can't change the whole country. Arguably, this is however poor the democracy functions. Again, it's essentially in that society, and it's part of your success in the earlier period, that there is the external accountability, the ability to hold politicians to account, was a big part of the success story. So bring a bit of that back. But you're not going to build Sweden overnight. And by the way, Syria, it's very far from Sweden, okay? I'll stick around for you for a second if you want informally to ask something. Yeah.
Thank you very much to Professor Dercon for this great talk, and I think we'll wrap it here. You get a final round of applause.
Thank you.